This story happened to one of you subscribers. Write any 8-letter word in the comments if you've ever felt like you saw or heard something unexplainable. We had been planning this trip for a long time. Right after the semester ended, our group of 5 set off on a journey to Romania, to the picturesque Vădăraru Lake. Everyone was full of excitement and joy at the start of the vacation, and no one could have imagined that this trip would be the last for many of us. As we stepped out of our minivan, our eyes immediately caught sight of the abandoned lake, which spread out picturesquely before us in the shade of a dense, ancient forest. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in orange and pink hues that reflected on the water's surface, giving it a mystical and ominous appearance. The lake seemed like a mirror, except for the places where a light breeze created small ripples. Tall, slender trees grew along the shores of the lake, forming a dense barrier between the water and the forest thicket that began behind it. These trees, with their long shadows, cast patterns on the water that blended with the sunset light, creating an effect of shimmering colors and shapes. The occasional sounds of nature that broke the silence, the cries of birds, the rustling of leaves, the scurrying of small animals in the underbrush, all added to the atmosphere of mystery and abandonment of this place. We chose this spot for a reason. My fiancé Marcus and I wanted to celebrate our engagement. We decided to do it somewhere far from all problems by the water, surrounded only by our closest friends. So we brought Leo, Maria, and Stefan with us. While we were all unpacking, Stefan looked at the smooth surface of the lake and said that it reminded him of a story he had heard from an old gas station attendant a few hours ago. The elderly man, with gray hair and wrinkles deeply etched into his face, spoke with a certain darkness and fear in his eyes about the past of this place. "This is no place for merrymaking, young man," he said, glancing over his shoulder as if afraid someone might hear them. According to the old man, a witch once lived on that island long ago, known to everyone as the local healer named Ivanka. The villagers nearby respected her for her ability to cure diseases and make healing potions and ointments. However, when a poor harvest devastated the lands and disease struck the livestock, all the villagers' suspicions fell on Ivanka. They believed that her magic had brought this misfortune upon the village as a price for playing with the laws of nature. The story ended in tragedy when one cold autumn evening, a mob of angry villagers stormed the island. They blamed Ivanka for all the misfortunes that had befallen them and decided to punish her in the most brutal way. According to the gas station attendant, they tied her up and threw her into the deepest part of the lake, where she drowned. Since then, no one dared to set foot on that island, and the lake began to be surrounded by a mystical aura. Although her body was submerged, the old man concluded, Ivanka's spirit continued to wander the island, causing the wind to whisper and a chill that penetrated to the bones. Sometimes you can hear her voice in the sound of the waves crashing against the rocks. These last words echoed in my memory as Stefan finished his story, and I thoughtfully looked at the island, which seemed to glow in the rays of the setting sun. Everyone else took the story skeptically, and Leo added that he wouldn't mind having a drink with a pretty witch. So, despite the cold breath of the wind that reminded us of the invisible presence of the past, we loaded our things and headed to the small island that stood out in the middle of the lake. We launched 2 boats we found in the weeds by the shore and set off across the quiet, ominous waters. The twilight heightened the sense of anxiety, but the thrill of adventure and the forbidden gave us strength. Maria sat next to me, tightly gripping my hand. I could feel her heart beating in rhythm with the oars cutting through the water. The closer we got to the island, the stronger the feeling that this decision might have been a mistake. After setting up camp, the mood among the group lifted. The evening promised to be warm and cheerful. Marcus lit a large fire that crackled, illuminating the surrounding rocks and trees. We settled around the fire, pulling out a guitar and marshmallows for roasting. I began to sing soft melodic songs accompanied by Leo and Stefan on the guitar. Maria, always cheerful and energetic, shouted jokes and told funny stories, making everyone laugh. As time passed, we opened bottles of wine we had brought with us and began exchanging toasts. To love, to adventure, to the future. Night slowly swallowed the day, and darkness enveloped the island with its soft but commanding embrace. The merriment continued, but with each tick of the clock, the night became more insistent and mysterious. At one point, Leo, feeling the need, decided to go to the bathroom and headed into the darkness of the island. When he returned after a while, we noticed he was carrying an old wooden box, battered and covered in moss, which must have been lying forgotten among the bushes. With curiosity and excitement, the guys opened it. Suddenly, Maria recoiled and gasped when she saw the contents. The box was filled with items that looked like tools for ancient potion making. Dried herbs in pouches, glass bottles with incomprehensible labels, and parchments written in ancient script with recipes and strange diagrams. But among all this, one item stood out, a vintage ring with a crimson stone that sparkled even in the dim firelight. In this enchanting night atmosphere, where everything around was already cloaked in intriguing mystery, I didn't notice when Marcus took out the magical vintage ring. Under the flickering light of the fire and the starry sky, he pulled out the ring with the crimson stone, which glittered with sparks at every movement of the fire, and got down on one knee. All eyes were fixed on this ancient, unusual piece of jewelry. I gazed at it with fascination, but there was also a hint of concern in my eyes due to the mystical aura surrounding our evening. Marcus gently took my hand, kissing my fingers tenderly. In his eyes, I saw love and warmth that made my heart flutter. He said that this ring should belong to me, but there was a note of mysterious fate in his words. When Marcus carefully slid the ring onto my finger, replacing the temporary engagement ring we had been using, I felt our bond grow even stronger. The kiss we shared was filled with love and affirmation of our feelings. But suddenly the air around us became cooler, and the wind seemed to whisper something elusive, almost unsettling. Was it just a coincidence or perhaps a warning? The question remained open, though I tried to ignore it and return to the celebration, dismissing that brief moment of unease. It was well past midnight when the celebration gradually quieted down, and everyone felt the fatigue after a long day. Friends began to notice strange sounds coming from the forest. Amidst laughter and jokes, Leo and Maria were the first to disappear. I noticed how Stefan had been observing their shy and interested glances all evening. He gave Leo the chance to make the first move and prove himself a true gentleman. Since their tent was designed for three, Stefan decided to take a walk along the shore to give them some space before returning for the night. Marcus and I were the last to head to our tent. He, like a true fiancé, scooped me up in his arms and disappeared with me into our shelter. Drifting into sleep, I suddenly woke up to a piercing scream that shattered the night silence. My heart instantly pounded in my chest and I jumped up, not understanding what was happening. The scream came from the direction of the lake, and something cold and sticky slowly crept into my heart. I hastily grabbed a flashlight and ran out of the tent, where Leo and Maria were already standing, both nervous and alert. Without a word, we ran to the shore where the screams continued to cut through the night. In the darkness that enveloped us, every sound seemed threatening, and every movement a harbinger of something terrible. The flashlight trembled in my hand, and I had to make an effort to keep the beam steady on the path ahead of us. When we finally reached the shore, a wave of horror washed over me. Leo stood knee-deep in the water, desperately trying to turn over Stefan's body, which floated in the dark, almost still water. The screams that tore from his chest sounded desperate and hopeless. Stefan didn't move. His body seemed unnaturally heavy, and his face unnaturally calm. Marcus rushed to Leo, helping to pull Stefan onto the shore. I stood aside, feeling fear grip every cell of my body, paralyzing me. Maria was also nearby, and we both held flashlights, illuminating scenes too eerie to be perceived as reality. The guys did everything they could to save Stefan, trying to expel the water from his lungs, administering first aid, but nothing worked. Every attempt was futile, and the silence that surrounded us only emphasized the hopelessness of the situation. I felt the darkness around us growing heavier, almost suffocating. It was as if the night itself was against us, watching our futile efforts with cold indifference. Horror and helplessness grew, consuming me entirely. I couldn't take my eyes off Stefan, whose body lay on the sand, motionless and cold. It felt like a sinister warning from which there was no escape. And in that moment, as I stood there illuminating this nightmarish scene, I felt a wave of cold, almost primal fear pierce me. sensing that something invisible and unspeakably terrifying was approaching us from the darkness, threatening to engulf us all. Despair and shock gripped us all as I watched Marcus's futile attempts to save Stefan. His hands, usually so strong and confident, now trembled with tension, and a shadow of hopelessness gradually appeared on his face. Each new attempt seemed even more futile, and with every passing minute my hope faded, dissolving into the night air, which suddenly became heavy and suffocating. I stood next to Maria, feeling her cold hands clutching mine. We couldn't find words to describe the horror that engulfed us. The sense of unreality mixed with growing fear slowly but surely penetrating every corner of my consciousness. The forest, which had seemed like a peaceful refuge just moments ago, now enveloped us in a heavy silence, hiding some unknown threat. And suddenly, like from a nightmare, we heard a woman's laughter. It was light, almost playful, but cold, like an icy breath touching my skin. Marcus raised his head, quickly turning the flashlight towards the sound, and for a moment I saw her. The same girl we had met earlier on the shore. Her figure, unreal and shimmering, stood among the trees, her black hair gently swaying in the air, and then she disappeared, dissolving into the darkness like a ghost. Panic seized us all, and without words we rushed to the spot where we had left the boats. But what awaited us there only intensified our horror. The boats were gone, leaving us without any hope of escape. The lake was quiet, but in that silence lurked something sinister, something that made my heart beat faster, and cold sweat covered my body. We stood by the water, confused and scared. Marcus tried to pull himself together, to calm us down, but I could hear the tremor in his voice. He was the only one trying to find a way out of this trap, but even he began to lose confidence. I felt fear gradually consuming us all, tightening its cold grip. We gathered around the fire, which was almost out, seeking comfort in its last warm sparks. But even this fire seemed powerless against the darkness that surrounded us from all sides. And the laughter. It echoed again, somewhere in the darkness, making us shudder with fear, feeling helpless and cornered. When the fear reached its peak, Marcus decided to act. He suggested searching the island for another way to escape, and we agreed, though each step was filled with fear and uncertainty. We moved forward, but it felt like the shadow of imminent danger was following us, stalking us like a wild beast waiting for its prey. When everyone set off into the forest to find a way out, I decided to stay by the fire. The shock and despair from losing Stefan still hadn't released me, and I couldn't force myself to take a single step. Thoughts swirled in my head, but the only clear thing was the desperate desire to survive, despite the hopelessness of the situation. I stared into the flickering sparks among the ashes, hoping to find some comfort, some hint of safety. But the shadows dancing around grew more sinister with each passing second, as if the darkness was trying to engulf me, to drag me into its cold, soulless embrace. Marcus, Leo, and Maria decided to venture into the dense forest, hoping to find another path to the shore. I watched as they split up. Maria headed north, barely illuminating her way with a small flashlight that seemed almost powerless in such darkness. Her figure quickly disappeared into the darkness, leaving me alone with my thoughts. She had always been determined and eager to be helpful, but something about this situation filled me with an overwhelming fear. The forest around us grew increasingly ominous. It seemed that the trees themselves harbored something malevolent, and I involuntarily shuddered at every rustle of leaves or gust of wind. I tried to distract myself from the terrifying thoughts, but couldn't shake the feeling that Maria would encounter something dreadful. And this feeling was confirmed when I heard a muffled scream lost in the rustling of the forest. My heart clenched with fear, and my mind stubbornly tried to convince me that everything was fine, that it was just my nerves playing tricks on me. But fear gradually consumed me, and I knew that scream couldn't have been just my imagination. Some time passed, and when Maria didn't return to the fire, Marcus and Leo went to look for her. I was left alone, feeling fear closing in on me from all sides like a heavy shroud. Their desperate cry when they found her body shattered the eerie silence, and my soul seemed to collapse into an abyss. I knew my friend was dead. Her absence, Marcus's scream, the silence that followed, all convinced me of one thing. We were trapped, and death was stalking us. After Maria's death, Marcus and Leo decided not to separate anymore. They moved together like two ghosts wandering through the night forest, trying to find any hope of rescue. I stayed by the fire, feeling how this forest was gradually becoming more hostile and unwelcoming. Fatigue and fear consumed me, but I knew I had to stay strong, even if my strength was waning. The fire was dying down, and my mind was filled with thoughts of whether we would ever get out of here alive. I remained by the fire, feeling fear gradually tightening its grip on me from within. Every new gust of wind seemed like a voice whispering to me about the inevitability of something terrible. The forest around us grew increasingly sinister, shrouded in mist. And when Marcus returned to check on me and said he had found a narrow path between the rocks, I already knew it wouldn't lead to salvation. But none of us could sit idly by, and he decided to explore the path first. So I watched as he disappeared into the thick fog, and almost immediately felt something clutching at my heart. He quickly vanished from sight, and even the sound of his footsteps dissolved into the dense grayness that enveloped us. Suddenly, the silence was broken by a scream that pierced me like a needle. It was Marcus. His voice was filled with pain and despair, and the worst part was that I couldn't do anything. I rushed in that direction, but my legs seemed to refuse to obey. The fog grew even thicker, and I couldn't see even my hands in front of me. Every step felt like a step into an abyss. When Leo returned, he was alone. His face was deathly pale, and tears stood in his eyes. I couldn't believe that Marcus was dead. Something inside me refused to accept it. It seemed like a terrible mistake, that Leo just couldn't find him, that he was alive, that I could still help him. But Leo only shook his head sadly, and I realized there was no hope. I collapsed to the ground like a broken doll, overwhelmed with grief. My hands trembled as I hugged myself, trying to protect myself from the cold that pierced me not only from the outside but also from within. I whispered Marcus's name like a prayer, trying to bring him back to life with my pain, my despair. But there was only silence and the fog that swallowed everything. When Leo said he would try to swim to the shore and call for help, I knew I couldn't hold him back any longer. He explained his plan to me, but his words sounded like a distant whisper in my ears. My heart clenched with fear and despair, and each beat grew louder, like a countdown to something terrible. I felt that he might not return either, that this island wouldn't let us go so easily. I watched as Leo entered the cold water, trying to remember every detail as if it were our last meeting. He was a good swimmer, and I saw him quickly disappear into the watery mist, but the sense of hopelessness only grew stronger. The night was quiet, too quiet, and the silence became my worst nightmare. I knew I was alone, but I couldn't force myself to look away from the spot where Leo had disappeared because something inside me still hoped for a miracle. But there were no miracles here, only fear and darkness. The water around me was as black as the night, and the air was thick with anxiety. As Leo began to swim, I stood on the shore, feeling all my strength leaving me with each of his movements in the water. I kept my eyes on him, trying not to succumb to the fear that he might not return. But with each wave, this fear grew. It seemed as if the minutes stretched into eternity. My heart pounded, and my mind imagined the worst scenarios. And then, he was no longer visible. The fog, which suddenly thickened, swallowed him, and my heart clenched with horror. I felt the cold seeping into my bones, not even realizing whether it was from the night or the very thought that he wouldn't return. Silence fell like a heavy stone, and only my breathing disturbed this eerie stillness. But the silence was deceptive. When I heard the rustle of sand behind me, my heart seemed to stop. Turning around, I saw her, the creature so many legends spoke of. Her face was unnaturally white, and her eyes cold and bottomless, like the gaze of death itself. I felt fear paralyze my body. My mind was blank, and the only thing left was the ghostly feeling that life was about to end. She didn't speak, just silently stared at me, and in her gaze I saw the depth of darkness. I don't even remember how I took off that cursed ring and threw it at her feet. My movements were automatic, as if I wasn't controlling them. When she disappeared as suddenly as she had appeared, I was left alone. But with each moment, the anxiety only grew because the night didn't want to let me go. And then I saw the boat. It seemed like my only chance for salvation, but as I climbed into it, I didn't feel relief. Only a heaviness, as if something invisible was pressing on my shoulders, making me think this wasn't the end. I sat in the boat, watching the island gradually disappear into the mist, and felt the invisible force that had held me here since our arrival finally release me. But even then, when the island was out of sight, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had stayed with me, something dark and inexplicable that was now a part of me. Now let me share a moment from my life. I'm an artist, and oil painting both inspires and relaxes me. 8 years ago, I was so immersed in it that I earned a Bachelor of Arts and now work as an art restorer in Barcelona. One day I looked back and realized the knowledge I needed when I was just starting out. That's why I've prepared an online course with 14 visual and practical lessons for you. No talking heads or pointless chatter. Just rich content that's immediately applicable in practice, all for the price of renting a car for a day. Art therapy is a great way to deal with anxiety. Just check out the course content via the link in the pinned comment or in the channel description.